The story begins where most maps end in a scattered chain of islands stretching like a broken necklace between Asia and the Pacific. Here, in the dense rainforests of Luzon and the limestone caves of Palawan, lies one of humanity's oldest and least understood legacies. Not in monuments, not in manuscripts, but in the DNA of the Filipino people. Unlike any other place on Earth, the Philippines was never just a destination. It was a crossing. A corridor through which multiple human waves passed, and sometimes stayed. And their footprints weren't left in stone. They were encoded in blood. Long before recorded history, before pottery, before farming, even before the idea of kingdoms, the first modern humans stepped onto these islands. They were small in stature, dark in skin, with tightly curled hair and wide-set eyes. Today, we know them as the Negritos, the Aita, the Agta, the ATI. But their origins stretch far deeper than the Philippines. They belong to a lineage that broke away from the early human migration out of Africa and moved swiftly into Southeast Asia and Oceania, a sister branch to Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. Geneticists estimate that their ancestors arrived in the Philippines up to 50,000 years ago, when sea levels were low and land bridges still existed across what is now open ocean. They were not the tail end of a wave. They were the beginning of presence in this region. And remarkably, they're still here. But buried within their DNA is a secret even more ancient. In 2021, a groundbreaking study found that an indigenous Negrito group, the Aita Magbukan, carry the highest known levels of Denisovan DNA in any living population on Earth. Not just higher than Asians, higher than Papuans, higher than Australians. This is not a minor detail. This rewrites the rules. It means that at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, their ancestors interbred with Denisovans, an extinct species of archaic humans who left behind only teeth, bone fragments, and genetic whispers. And yet, here in the Philippines, those whispers are louder than anywhere else. The Aita Magbukan carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry, a percentage more than 30% higher than any previously studied group. That's not background noise, that's a legacy. It implies not just a one-time encounter, but sustained contact potentially here, in these very islands. What does this mean? It means the Philippines was not a genetic backwater, not a far-flung end of the line. It was a contact zone, a place where deep human lineages overlapped in ways no one expected. A place where ancient hominin groups met, mixed, and survived together. These first Filipinos didn't just pass through. They endured across millennia of tropical disease, isolation, and shifting ecosystems. And over time, they adapted. Traits like G6PD deficiency, which today requires medical caution, may once have provided protection from malaria. Other mutations, still being studied, suggest survival advantages shaped by an unforgiving environment. And then, a new wave arrived. Not by foot, by sea. Roughly 4,000 years ago, a second great migration came sweeping down from the island of Taiwan, Austronesian-speaking peoples who brought with them rice, pottery, and navigation skills that would eventually connect Madagascar to Easter Island. But in the Philippines, they didn't erase the people who were already here. They merged with them. This wasn't conquest, it was convergence. Among these Austronesians, one group would leave a particularly enduring genetic signature, the Cordillerans. Isolated in the highlands of northern Luzon, the Cordillerans today represent the least admixed branch of the Austronesian expansion, a pure thread of East Asian ancestry preserved by altitude and terrain. But here's where the story breaks from the textbook. Genetic studies reveal that the Cordillerans actually diverged from Taiwanese Aboriginal populations at least 8,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Austronesian expansion into the Pacific officially began. This suggests something profound, that parts of what we call the Austronesian genome were already evolving in the Philippines before it radiated outwards. In other words, the Philippines wasn't just a stop along the way. It may have been one of the starting points. Because when you analyze Filipino genomes today, from the bustling cities of Metro Manila to the forest-dwelling Agta, you find a common thread: Cordilleran ancestry. Whether they know it or not, Nearly every Filipino carries a fragment of this highland lineage, passed down through centuries of mixing, surviving, and storytelling. So what makes Filipino DNA so unique? It's not just the ancient age of its origins, though that would be enough. It's not just the record-setting Denisovan legacy, though no other population in the world comes close. The Philippines stands as the genetic crossroads of Asia and Oceania, where multiple waves of humanity collided, combined, and carved a lasting biological memory into its people. The story has just begun. What if your ancestry wasn't a single line, but a layered manuscript, 5 stories written over tens of thousands of years, bound into one identity? For millions of Filipinos, that's exactly what their DNA reveals. Not one origin. 5. In 2021, a landmark genomic study sequenced over 1,000 Filipino individuals from dozens of ethno-linguistic groups. What the researchers found was astonishing. Filipino ancestry doesn't follow the simple two-wave model Negritos and Austronesians as previously thought. Instead, it traces 5 separate migration events, each leaving behind a distinct genetic fingerprint. Let's go deeper. The first, the northern Negritos. These are the earliest arrivals, possibly over 46,000 years ago, arriving from what is now Sundaland. Their descendants live today in the forests of Luzon, their DNA echoing ancient human dispersals. The second wave came later, the southern Negritos, such as the Mamanwa, entering through the Sulu archipelago and into Mindanao. These two branches may share ancestry with Papuans, but they're not identical. Genetic divergence dates show these groups split thousands of years apart, meaning the Philippines wasn't just settled once. It was settled again, and again, by entirely distinct early human populations. Have you ever wondered why a Negrito group in Mindanao looks and sounds different from one in Luzon? That's not just culture, that's deep genetic divergence. It's a time capsule of 2 ancient waves, preserved. Then comes the third layer, early East Asian migrants who arrived before the main Austronesian expansion. Groups like the Manobo in Mindanao carry these ancient East Asian markers. But here's the twist. Their DNA predates the mainstream Austronesian migration. They were in the Philippines before the Austronesian farmers spread through the islands. Who were they? Were they coastal traders? Maritime drifters from the mainland? The data suggests ties to Austroasiatic-speaking populations like the Htin or Mlabri of Thailand. But the truth island? We don't know. Yet. The fourth wave? A hauntingly beautiful lineage. The Papuan, related influx. Detected mostly in southern Mindanao, this trace of Oceania is small, but it's real. It suggests prehistoric contact with peoples south of the Philippines, long before modern borders. And finally, the fifth, the Cordilleran Austronesians, who form the ancestral backbone of most Filipinos today. They arrived roughly 4,000 years ago, but they weren't just any Austronesians. These were highland-dwelling, genetically isolated people, whose genome remained remarkably unmixed even today. Their DNA diverged from indigenous Taiwanese groups 8,000 years ago before farming reached Luzon. Here's where it gets emotional. This group, the Cordillerans, carry a kind of ancient clarity. Whether you're Tagalog or Visayan, Ilocano or Bicolano, your genome likely includes this Cordilleran thread. It's the hidden backbone of Filipino identity. How is it possible that so many groups who speak different languages, eat different food, and wear different symbols share this common root? Because the Philippines is not a land of tribes. It's a land of fusion. Over centuries, these 5 ancestral layers didn't stay separate. They wove into each other. Through trade, through migration, through intermarriage, through war and peace. From Eta to Tagalog, from Manobo to Cebuano, every Filipino today carries fragments of these ancient waves. There is no pure group. And that's not a loss. It's a legacy. It means that when a modern Filipino walks down the street, they don't just represent one moment in time. They represent 5 epochs of human movement, from the oldest Australo-Melanesian branches to the seafaring architects of the Austronesian world. But here's something even more fascinating. These layers don't divide the country. They unify it. Genetically, Filipinos share more with each other across islands and ethnic lines than they do with any external population, even their supposed cousins in Taiwan or Indonesia. How can that be? Because once the wave settled, they never left. Instead, they blended again and again. By the time the Spanish arrived, most of that mixture had already happened. Long before colonial surnames and centralized governments, the genetic identity of the Philippines had already been written by 5 ancestral migrations, 1 island chain, and thousands of years of human resilience. That's why when someone asks, "Where do Filipinos come from?" there isn't one answer. There are 5, and all of them are still alive, in every heartbeat. If you zoom out and look at the Philippines on a map, it seems like a single country, a tropical archipelago united under one flag. But zoom in, and that illusion collapses. This isn't one place. It's over 7,000 separate worlds, each with its own rivers, dialects, histories, and yes, even its own genetic code. Let's be honest, most people think of genetic diversity in terms of race or nationality, but the Philippines tells a different story. Here, 2 villages separated by a mountain ridge might share fewer genetic similarities than 2 countries across the sea. Why? Because the Philippines is designed for isolation. Steep mountain ranges cut through Luzon. Dense jungles wall off the interiors of Mindanao. Entire island provinces like Batanes or Palawan drift culturally and genetically apart, not for decades, but for millennia. And in that isolation, something extraordinary happens. DNA begins to drift. Not by choice, but by nature. Ever heard of the founder effect? It's what happens when a small, isolated population, maybe just a few hundred people, starts to evolve separately from the larger world. Over generations, their genetic traits become uniquely concentrated. Now, multiply that by 1,000 islands. That's the Philippines. Take the Ivatan people of Batanes. Their homeland sits closer to Taiwan than to Manila. Yet they've developed a genetic profile that is distinct, not fully Austronesian, not entirely Negrito. Something in between. Something local. In the Cordillera region, highland groups like the Kankanay and Ibuloy carry a version of Austronesian DNA that is so undiluted, it's been used as a reference point in international genome studies. That's how intact it island. But move just a few hundred kilometers south, and you'll find the Tagalog, whose genomes show higher Negrito admixture, likely due to centuries of intermarriage with local Ada communities. Not radically different, but different enough to be measured. Isn't it incredible? One country, one language family, dozens of micro-divergent genomes. But it gets better. In Panay Island, an inherited neurological condition known as X-linked dystonia Parkinsonism is found in clusters. Why there? Because a single genetic mutation, carried by one ancestor over 2,000 years ago, was preserved in genetic isolation. In no other population on Earth is this disorder so concentrated. That's the power and consequence of island genetics. It can preserve rare adaptations, but it can also lock in rare vulnerabilities. Another example? The Samabajao sea nomads. For generations, they've lived almost entirely on water, diving for fish in the Sulu and Celebes seas. Modern studies show they carry a genetic variant that enlarges the spleen, a biological diving tank, releasing oxygen-rich blood during extended underwater hunts. That mutation? It's not found in other Filipino groups, not even in their closest neighbors. Why not? Because culture creates biology, but only when isolation gives it time to work. Have you ever wondered why certain diseases appear more often in some provinces than others? Why one ethnic group might process alcohol differently than another? Why drug reactions vary by region? This isn't random. These are the fingerprints of isolation. Isolation doesn't only shape genes, it shapes identities. It's why the Lumad tribes of Mindanao remain distinct, both linguistically and genetically, even after waves of colonization and national integration. It's why the Ifugao, builders of the rice terraces, preserved a genetic continuity that survived centuries of outside pressure. But make no mistake, this isn't division. This is depth. Because while Filipino communities diverged, they never stopped interacting. Through trade, Through marriage, through shared migrations, their genetic signatures crossed and blurred. But within that blur, distinct colors remain. So next time someone says Filipino, as if it's a single identity, pause. Ask, which island? Which mountain? Which bloodline? Because in this country, diversity isn't imported, it's inherited. Have you ever thought about what your body remembers even if your mind doesn't? Because somewhere in your blood, your bones, even your breath, ancient memories live on. In the Philippines, these memories are written not in books, but in mutations. Adaptations passed from parent to child not as choices, but as survival mechanisms. Let's begin with something as small as an enzyme. It's called G6PD glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. If you're Filipino, there's a chance you've been screened for it. Maybe your newborn was. But what most people don't know is that this enzyme deficiency, which can cause serious health risks if triggered, also holds a story. A story of malaria, of heat and hardship and evolutionary bargaining. In many Filipino communities, especially in the southern provinces, G6PD deficiency is surprisingly common, up to 1 in 4 people in some regions. Why? Because in ancient times, this deficiency provided a kind of natural shield against severe malaria. It was a trade. Resistance to one disease in exchange for vulnerability to others. That's not rare. That's evolution in action. Your DNA learning how to fight the land you live in. But G6PD isn't the only adaptation shaped by the islands. Let's talk about the ocean. For centuries, the Samabajao people have lived their lives at sea, not just on boats, but underwater. They free dive without oxygen tanks to hunt fish, gather shells, and search reefs. But how do they do it? A recent genetic study uncovered something remarkable. Bajau divers carry a variant in a gene called PDE10-ampere, which contributes to an enlarged spleen, essentially a natural reservoir for oxygenated blood. During long dives, this gives them a head start, more red blood cells to circulate, more time to stay submerged. That's not training. That's not willpower. That's inherited biology, shaped by generations of deep diving. It's a reminder. Culture doesn't just shape stories, it shapes genomes. But not every adaptation is a superpower. On Panay Island, a rare neurological disorder has haunted families for generations. X-linked dystonia Parkinsonism, or XDP. It begins with tremors. It progresses into full-body dystonia, twisting muscles, locked limbs, impaired speech. Why here? Geneticists traced it to a single mutation in a common ancestor thousands of years ago. Because Panay's population remained relatively closed over generations, that mutation, once rare, became more common within a specific genetic line. That's the cost of genetic memory. It can preserve what helps, but also what hurts. Even beyond these dramatic examples, Filipino DNA is full of subtle adaptations. Enzymes that affect alcohol metabolism, inherited from ancient East Asian admixture, explain why some Filipinos flush red or feel unwell after drinking. That reaction isn't a social quirk. It's a genetic trait linked to ALDH2 gene variants. In some regions, researchers have also found elevated frequencies of genes associated with beta thalassemia, a blood disorder that, in its milder forms, may have once offered protection against malaria, much like sickle cell traits in Africa. So when someone says, adaptation, don't just think about climate or elevation. Think about disease, diet, behavior, and history, all colliding in your DNA. And here's the wild part. Scientists believe that the high Denisovan ancestry in some Filipino groups like the Aita Magbukan might carry even more surprises. In Tibetans, Denisovan genes helped with high-altitude adaptation. In Papuans, they may influence immune responses. What about in Filipinos? That's the question researchers are racing to answer. Could Denisovan segments in Filipino DNA provide unique immunities, metabolic advantages, resistance to ancient viruses? The Truth Island. We don't fully know yet, but it's coming. Because the Philippine Genome Center and other institutions are now doing the deep work, not just mapping identity, but unlocking health insights hidden in ancestry. This matters. Not just for science, for families, for medicine, for future generations. Imagine treatments tailored for Filipino-specific gene profiles, screenings that understand cultural as well as biological context, medications that work because your DNA was finally heard. That's what Adaptation Island. That's what Memory Island. It's not just what made us, it's what saves us. It's easy to look at a surname, a skin tone, or a borrowed word and think foreign influence. But what if the truth is more layered than it seems? Because in the Philippines, what came from outside didn't overwrite the old, it fused with it. It settled. It adapted. Until even the foreign became local. Let's talk Spain. 377 years of colonization. Churches, flags, surnames. But genetically, the legacy is thinner than most people think. A recent genome-wide analysis found that most Filipinos carry less than 5% European DNA, and in many regions, the number drops below 1%. That's right, centuries of Spanish rule and the blood barely changed. Why? Because colonialism didn't arrive with families. It came with soldiers, administrators, priests, mostly male. And very few stayed long enough to create generational lines. Most mixed unions happened in port cities Manila, Zamboanga, Vigan, not in the rural heartlands. And the children of those unions? They became Filipino, not Spanish. But there's another twist. Some of the European-looking features in Filipino families didn't come from Spain at all. They came from Mexico. During the galleon trade, thousands of soldiers, sailors, and settlers from New Spain, modern-day Mexico, and Peru were sent across the Pacific. Many of them had Native American ancestry, and they brought it with them. You read that right. A portion of Filipino DNA, around 2% on average, comes not from Europe or Asia, but from the Americas. Ever seen a Filipino with facial features that don't quite align with Asian or European norms? Maybe their ancestry reaches not westward but east, across the Pacific. That's the kind of history no textbook teaches. But the story doesn't stop at Spanish ships. Long before colonization, trade winds brought the Chinese. Centuries of migration from Fujian and Guangdong filled the ports of Manila, Iloilo, and Cebu with Hokkien-speaking traders, many of whom married local women. Their descendants, the Sangli mestizos, would go on to shape commerce, education, and politics across the islands. By the 1802, 1 in 10 residents of Manila was fully Chinese, and far more had mixed ancestry. Today, it's estimated that up to 20% of Filipinos have some Chinese DNA. But here's what's remarkable: most don't even know it, because over generations, the culture blended. The names changed, the boundaries blurred, until what was once a foreign root became part of the Filipino tree. But what about India? Pre-colonial trade routes connected southern Mindanao and the Visayas with Indianized kingdoms from Java and Sumatra. Gold, spices, and Sanskrit words flowed through these corridors, and so did genes. Genetic studies have found traces of South Asian ancestry in parts of the Philippines, especially in Cebu, where up to 10–20% of the DNA in some individuals shows Indian admixture. This wasn't conquest, it was contact. Quiet, sustained, and biologically lasting. Still think foreign ancestry in the Philippines came only with Spain? Look closer. The deeper layers came by sea, not by empire. Even after Spain left, America arrived. But unlike Latin America, the American occupation of the Philippines didn't leave much genetic trace. There were some intermarriages, yes, especially after World War II, but the overall European-American DNA input remains minimal. So what does all this mean? It means that foreign ancestry in the Philippines is not about domination. It's about absorption. Each new arrival added a layer, not erased what came before. Mexican, Chinese, Indian, Spanish, even Arab and Japanese influences. They all left fingerprints, but they never replaced the foundation. Because beneath every colonial trace is something older, something local, something native. The Filipino genome is not a borrowed thing. It's a weaving where every thread, no matter how foreign its origin, is pulled into the same intricate fabric. It's why someone with Chinese blood might speak fluent Visayan. Why a family with a Spanish surname might carry Cordilleran genes. Why a descendant of a Mexican soldier could be Ada in ancestry. In the Philippines, bloodlines don't form borders, they form bridges. Every island tells a story. But some islands tell the story of everyone. If you dropped a pin anywhere across the Philippine archipelago on a mountain village in Ifugao, a coral atoll in Tawi-Tawi, a city street in Cebu, you wouldn't just land on a place. You'd land on a human archive. Because these islands are more than landforms. They are living databases of where we came from and how far we've traveled. At first glance, Filipino DNA seems like a mystery, too many influences, too many variations. But zoom out, and a pattern starts to emerge. A structure, a roadmap. In population genetics, this is called a clinal gradient, a gradual genetic shift across geography. In the Philippines, that gradient flows across both time and space, from archaic to modern, from Negrito to Austronesian, from mountain to sea. And that's not theory. That's been measured. A recent full genome study covering 1,082 individuals across 115 indigenous communities didn't just show variation, it revealed alignment. Ethnic groups that seemed culturally disconnected were, at the genetic level, deeply interwoven. And that pattern reflected migration routes, sea channels, even ancient trade winds. It's like reading a map, not on paper, but inside the human body. And guess what? The Philippines is the key legend of that map. Why? Because its location perched between mainland Asia and the Pacific made it a genetic gateway. Every major human wave moving east had to pass through here, and many stayed. It's the only region where DNA from Australo-Melanesian foragers, Austronesian voyagers, mainland East Asians, and even Papuan-connected groups all converge. There is no other population in the world that captures that intersection. Have you ever thought about that? That your blood might carry the coordinates of migration?